The Diplomat's Dance by Julian Rhodes. The crisp autumn air of 1857 swept through the streets of Saint Petersburg, carrying with it the whispers of change that seemed to define the era. Alexandra Vorontsova stood at her bedroom window, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on the frost-kissed glass as she watched the city prepare for another day of bustling activity. At 20, she had already declined 3 marriage proposals, much to her mother's growing despair. "Sasha, my dear," her mother's voice carried from the doorway, using the familiar diminutive that Alexandra had grown up with. "The Countess Orlova's ball is tonight. I trust you'll make an effort to be sociable this time." Alexandra turned, her dark curls catching the morning light. "Yes, Mama. Though I fail to see why every ball must turn into an examination of potential suitors." Her mother, Natalia Petrovna, swept into the room with the grace that years of aristocratic training had instilled. "Because, my stubborn daughter, you cannot remain unmarried forever. Your father's position demands certain considerations." Alexandra knew these considerations well. Her father, Mikhail Dmitrievich Vorontsov, served as a trusted advisor to the Tsar, and their family's social obligations were as much political as they were personal. Still, she yearned for something more than the carefully orchestrated matches that defined her social circle. The day passed in a flurry of preparation. As evening approached, Alexandra found herself transformed by her maid's skilled hands into the very picture of Russian nobility. Her emerald green silk gown, imported from Paris, whispered against the floor as she descended the grand staircase of the Orlova mansion later that night. The ballroom blazed with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Alexandra moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting the occasional dance partner while avoiding any prolonged conversations that might give false hope to yet another ambitious young man. It was during one such tactical retreat that she quite literally collided with him. "My sincerest apologies, mademoiselle," a deep voice said in French, the lingua franca of Russian nobility. Strong hands steadied her before she could stumble. Alexandra looked up into eyes the color of a winter sky, gray-blue, and somehow both warm and distant at once. The stranger wore a military uniform, but not one she recognized from the usual regiments that frequented St. Petersburg's social scene. "The fault was entirely mine," she replied in the same language, though she noticed his French carried a slight English accent. "I'm afraid I was paying more attention to my escape than my path." A smile touched his lips. "Escape? Should I be summoning the guards?" "Only if you wish to save me from another tedious conversation about the weather and my opinions on the latest opera." The words slipped out before she could catch them, and Alexandra felt her cheeks warm at her own impropriety. Rather than taking offense, the stranger's smile widened. "Ah, then perhaps I should assist in your escape instead. I'm Thomas Blackwood, recently attached to the British Embassy." He offered a formal bow. "Might I have the honor of a dance?" I promised to avoid any discussion of weather or opera. There was something refreshingly direct about him, a quality Alexandra had rarely encountered in the carefully choreographed dance of Russian high society. "Alexandra Mikhailovna Vorontsova," she introduced herself with a small curtsy. "And yes, you may." As they took their places for the quadrille, Alexandra could feel the curious eyes of the other guests. A foreign diplomat was one thing, but an English one, at a time when relations between their nations remained tense in the aftermath of the Crimean War, was quite another. "You've caused quite a stir by attending tonight," she observed as they moved through the first figures of the dance. "So I've noticed. Though I must admit, causing a stir was rather the point." His eyes held a hint of mischief. Sometimes the best way to ease tensions is to walk directly into the lion's den and prove oneself harmless. "And are you harmless, Mr. Blackwood?" "That would rather depend on whom you ask, wouldn't it?" He guided her through a turn with surprising grace for an Englishman. "Your father, for instance, might have quite a different opinion than the young ladies who seem to be watching our every move." Alexandra's step nearly faltered. "You know who my father is?" "I make it my business to know the key players in any diplomatic arena. Mikhail Dmitrievich is well respected in London, even if our countries don't always see eye to eye." The music drew them apart before she could respond, and when they came together again, Alexandra found herself studying him with new interest. "You're rather direct for a diplomat. Perhaps that's why they sent me here. Sometimes the best way to navigate murky waters is with clear sight and honest words." The dance ended too quickly, and as Thomas led her from the floor, Alexandra felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. He wasn't like the other men who had sought her attention. There was no obvious attempt to impress or overwhelm her with flattery. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, drawing her into a conversation about literature that revealed a sharp mind and unexpected depth of knowledge about Russian authors. "You've read Pushkin in the original Russian?" she asked, surprised. "I believe that to understand a people, one must understand their poetry, although I must admit my pronunciation still leaves much to be desired." Their conversation was interrupted by Alexandra's mother, who appeared with all the subtle force of a summer storm. "Sashenka, darling, the Princess Golitsina has been asking after you." Alexandra recognized the polite dismissal for what it was, but before she could make her excuses, Thomas spoke up. "Madame Vorontsova, I presume. Your daughter has been kind enough to correct my terrible Russian pronunciation. Perhaps you would permit me to call upon your family tomorrow. I would very much like to continue our discussion of literature." Natalia Petrovna's expression shifted from slight disapproval to calculating interest. After all, while an English diplomat might not have been her first choice for her daughter, he was still a diplomat. "We would be delighted, Mr. Blackwood. Shall we say 3 o'clock?" And so began a courtship that set all of St. Petersburg talking. Thomas called regularly, always under the watchful eye of Alexandra's mother or one of her aunts. They discussed literature, politics, and philosophy, each conversation revealing new layers to his character that intrigued Alexandra more and more. But it was during a chance encounter in the winter garden of the Vorontsov mansion that everything changed. Alexandra had retreated there one afternoon, seeking solitude with her book, only to find Thomas already present, apparently deep in thought. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't aware you were calling today." He started slightly, then smiled. "I was meeting with your father, actually. Business of state and all that. And now you're hiding in our winter garden? Sometimes one needs a moment to collect one's thoughts." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something, especially when those thoughts are particularly important. Alexandra settled onto a nearby bench, her book forgotten. Important thoughts often benefit from a sympathetic ear, even when they concern matters of both heart and state. He moved closer, though still maintaining a proper distance. "I've been offered a new posting. In Constantinople." Alexandra felt her heart skip a beat. "I see. When would you leave?" "That rather depends on you, Alexandra Mikhailovna." She looked up sharply at the use of her name. Thomas had moved to stand before her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "I've spoken with your father," he continued, "about matters both diplomatic and personal. He has given his blessing, should you be willing to consider a life that might take you far from St. Petersburg." Understanding dawned slowly. "Mr. Blackwood, are you?" "Thomas, please." "And yes, I am proposing something rather more significant than another discussion of literature." He knelt before her, proper English gentleman to his core. "I find myself in the unique position of serving both my country and my heart. The posting in Constantinople comes with the requirement that I be married. Apparently, they feel it lends stability to diplomatic relations. I could have chosen any number of suitable English ladies, but I find I cannot imagine such a life with anyone but you." Alexandra's heart thundered in her chest. "You're asking quite a lot. To leave everything I know, to live in a foreign land." "I'm asking for a partnership," he corrected gently. "Your intelligence, your wit, your understanding of people, these aren't qualities I seek to remove from the world by making you merely a diplomat's wife. In Constantinople, we could build something together. Your knowledge of Russian culture and society would be invaluable, and you would have the freedom to pursue your own interests. And if those interests include continuing to correct your Russian pronunciation?" The tension broke as they both laughed. Thomas reached for her hand, and Alexandra allowed him to take it. "I would welcome it, especially since I plan to continue my study of Russian literature. Though perhaps we could alternate with you learning English poetry." Alexandra looked at their joined hands, then up into those winter sky eyes that had first caught her attention. In them she saw not just affection but respect and understanding. This was not a man seeking to possess or control her, but one offering a true partnership. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to English poetry, or yes to everything. To Constantinople, to partnership, to adventure." She squeezed his hand. "To us." Their wedding, held 3 months later, was the social event of the season. Alexandra wore white silk trimmed with Russian lace, while Thomas cut a striking figure in his diplomatic uniform. They exchanged vows in both Russian Orthodox and Anglican ceremonies, a symbol of the bridges they hoped to build in their life together. As they prepared to depart for Constantinople, Alexandra's mother pulled her aside. "I must admit, Sashenka, when you refused those first 3 proposals, I feared you were being merely stubborn. Now I see you were being wise." Alexandra hugged her mother tightly. "I was waiting for a man who could see me as I am. not as society wishes me to be. And does he see you truly? Alexandra looked across the room to where Thomas was deep in conversation with her father. His Russian noticeably improved after months of practice. He sees me, and he shows me new ways to see the world. What more could I ask for in a partner? As their carriage pulled away from the Vorontsov mansion, Alexandra felt Thomas's hand slip into hers. The spring air was thick with the scent of possibilities, and ahead lay a future neither of them could fully predict, but both were eager to explore together. Having any regrets? Thomas asked softly. Alexandra smiled, thinking of all the circumstances that had led to this moment, a chance collision at a ball, conversations in the winter garden, and the courage to imagine a life different from the one she had been expected to lead. None at all, she replied, squeezing his hand, though I do hope you're prepared for many more Russian lessons. My dear Alexandra, he laughed, I'm counting on them. The carriage rolled on through the streets of Saint Petersburg, carrying them toward their new life together. Behind them lay the familiar world of Russian nobility, ahead the unknown adventures of Constantinople, and between them, the promise of a love built on understanding, respect, and the shared courage to forge their own path.